What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here with the first of several tournament videos that I'm going to have here on YouTube. This is the round of 16, and it is my match with a Aggression Luke deck versus a Double Red Sabine piloted by Yakos here. So we're gonna see how I do. So this is this Luke deck I think is a fairly unexciting Luke Red. By unexciting, I mean it has some new cards, but it's not like anything super revolutionary. I've honestly been a lot more focused on just getting a variety of decks and stuff for the channel than I have with super refining a build. So this deck is a refinement of this deck is a refinement of the Luke Red concept to some degree with some of the newer cards, but it hasn't been like super heavily tested. And ultimately, Luke Red versus Sabine is interesting. I think that one key factor is going to be the extent to which I can get good value out of Restore to heal up damage that Sabine does. If we can get to the late game, I am very advantaged, but if. So I am the control, Sabine is the beatdown, and we're going to see how this goes. We lead off. I have a restored arc. My opponent has a Rebel Pathfinder, so relatively basic starting units. I'm going to bring in Yoda. Yoda is a very nice unit to have here because he has Restore 2, and that's going to potentially represent a lot of healing over the course of the game if my opponent doesn't deal with it. The Restored Arc itself is also doing some healing, so I'm really happy. So Restored Arc into Yoda into Kanan, and with these open fires available is a really good opening for me. I have a lot of opportunities to restore damage that Sabine's doing early on and prevent things from getting out of control. My opponent uses Precision Fire to attack with the Pathfinder and deal +2 damage and defeat Yoda. So on the one hand, Yoda was defeated without having a huge impact, but I do get to draw a card from that. And additionally, the fact that my opponent did that means that's damage not going to the base. I think it is probably correct to clear Yoda there because it represents a lot of restore in the long term, but it's not something that I'm particularly upset about seeing. Additionally, I'm going to be able to remove my opponent's unit here with Tarkentown. So Sabine used, and we'll go ahead and Tarkentown that Saboteur off the board, trying to just get value from that base early on, prevent some incoming damage from that Pathfinder. And overall, this is a very solid place to be at the end of turn 2 for me, I think. My opponent has actually taken more damage than I have, and I do have the Restored Arc. My opponent does have a Spec Ops soldier to play, so it doesn't end up with a totally empty board, but we do have, I think the overall board scenario here is favorable to me. I draw a Luke's Lightsaber. This is kind of a risky card because my opponent is playing Aggression, the double red, the kind of centerpiece double red card, which does have a attachment or an upgrade removal function. So going for the Luke's Lightsaber is going to be risky here. I decided to resource Jedi Luke and keep both of these Kanans because Kanan is really good in this sort of mid-game that we are approaching now, whereas Jedi Luke doesn't come online for several other turns, and it's going to be important for me to manage this situation. Restored Arc continuing to damage my opponent's base and heal my base has actually kept me on full base HP at this point, and then a few hits to my opponent. We see the Spec Ops or the Spec Force Soldier hit the base for 2. I'm going to play Kanan, 4 cost 4/5. On attack, you may discard 1 card from the defending player's deck for each friendly Spectre unit. Heal 1 damage from your base for each different aspect. Now, it is worth noting that because my opponent is playing double red, that does mean that the value of Kanan's heal is probably not going to be quite as much as it is in some other matchups because there are going to be more mono cards in a double red deck probably. And additionally, the if I do get multiple discards, the odds of healing for 2 or 3 are going to be reduced just because, well, 3 isn't going to happen because there's only 2 aspects in my opponent's deck, and even 2, we could see 2 only red cards or 2 heroism only cards. Um, My opponent deploys Sabine and swings into the base for 3 damage, which I am fine with. That's just, it's one of those things that can happen in this scenario. Um, on the Sabine deploy turn, you tend to get a fair amount of tempo. My opponent deploys another Spec Force soldier and still has several resources available. I have taken initiative at this point. If I can draw Fleet Lieutenant, I can actually have Kanan defeat Sabine immediately. My opponent plays a Keep Fighting, readies up Sabine, and then I believe also plays a Medal Ceremony, so gives an experience token to up to 3 rebel units that have attacked this turn. So it ends up being an experience for one of the Spec Force soldiers and for Sabine. The other one was played this turn and didn't attack, so it doesn't get the bonus. And then Sabine swings in for 4 total damage because she is buffed by that Medal Ceremony and has her on attack ability. So fairly decent situation for my opponent there, managing to buff Sabine and one of the soldiers and get a fair chunk of damage to my base. In fact, I took 10 damage that turn, which is, not sustainable, but fortunately I have some methods to potentially stabilize here and get this game back on track. So I want to use Kanan to defeat the Spec Force soldier. If I had drawn a Fleet Lieutenant, I think it might be reasonable to use that to go after Sabine herself. But given that I do not have that sort of option, I think it makes sense in this scenario to go for the Spec Force soldier. So because Sabine is buffed also, I am not able to use Red 3 to set up an easy defeat for Sabine. So I'm going to use Cannon to defeat the experienced Spec Force soldier. He takes 3 damage. His ability triggers now and mills my opponent's top card. However, it is a Benthic 2 Tubes who is mono red, so it's only going to be 1 point of healing. However, every point of healing counts in this matchup against aggro. You want to have as much healing as you can get. There's actually a card that didn't make it into this version of the deck that I think I perhaps should have been running, and that's Make an Opening. So that can deal 2 damage. It can give a unit -2/-2 and heal 2 to your base, and that would be a really solid card in this scenario. My opponent plays General Dodonna here, who's actually a major problem. So Dodonna is a 4-cost 4/4 that gives other rebel units +1/+1. So if I don't deal with him immediately, that's going to be some annoying value for my opponent. Luckily for me, though, I have a lot of options. So in hand, I could kill Dodonna either with open fire or with a takedown. Um, because my hand is all kind of mid-cost cards, though, I don't have anything else that I can play on this turn. So we're going to just go for the takedown, given that it's the more expensive card, and that leaves me with the cheaper removal option available for later. And then, so Dodonna's off the board, and I don't need to worry about that Spec Force Soldier and Sabine being buffed. However, my opponent is going to get to do some damage to the base, so Sabine swings in for 4, and I'm going to go ahead and deal 2 damage to my opponent's base while healing 1 from my own with the Restored Arc, who is getting a lot of value. Um, Getting a lot of value with that Restored Arc. And so now my opponent has to choose. The Spec Force Soldier can either trade with Kanan or attack the base, and opts to trade with Kanan, which I think is pretty reasonable. So by attacking into Kanan here, it prevents me from killing Sabine if I draw a card that would allow a buffed attack into Sabine. Um, and thinking about my resourcing here, this turn I'll get to deploy Luke, and hopefully he's going to take control of the game for me. I still have some nice healing cards in hand here with the option to play Yoda or Kanan. I have some removal as well with Open Fire and with Takedown. And so we're going to move on and see what we do. I resourced the red 3 there. Since Sabina's been buffed by the experience, she's up at 6 HP, which means that red 3 does not take me to the 5 damage breakpoint. So deploying Luke 4/7, and on attack he can give a shield to another unit, usually a friendly unit. My opponent swings into my base for 4 damage. I'm going to go ahead and give Luke a Jedi lightsaber here. So this gives him +3/+3. And on attack, he gives the defender -2/-2. So that's going to allow him to defeat Sabine in 1 shot. Now, this is a bit of a risky play because if my opponent has aggression, he can play it, defeat the upgrade, and ready Sabine, which would be a quite irksome play for me. I think it's possible that I actually should have just done open fire on Sabine at this point, which is a safer play. If I do open the fire and my opponent has aggression to ready, I'm in position to attack and defeat Sabine immediately. But if that's not the case, things could look different. We see, I believe that's a Benthic 2 Tubes that we see being deployed. I'm going to go ahead and have Luke attack and defeat Sabine, putting the shield on my restored arc. I unfortunately forget to use the on attack ability of the Jedi lightsaber to give Sabine -2/-2, which is I think a missed trigger or whatever. So I do end up taking 3 damage with Luke where I should have only taken 1. Um, However, it's still an easy defeat for my opponent's leader with that nice buff from the saber. Shield on the restored arc puts me in a better position for that space arena, and we're going to see how things continue here in this game. My opponent brings out another Spec Force soldier. I believe we've seen all 3 of those cards now. Not the hypest thing in the world. I think maybe seeing some kind of weaker cards at this point, some smaller ones, which I'm happy to see instead of K2s or whatever. I'm going to play Yoda as well, and I have now seen my 3rd copy of Kanan, which is quite handy. Overall, I'm feeling pretty confident about this game at this point. I think that I've gotten to a fairly stabilized position. I only have 10 HP left, but I have 2 healing units on the board, another unit that can potentially provide further healing in hand. Luke is on the field with the Jedi lightsaber. I really just feel like I have a lot of ways to deal with what my opponent is doing and to heal to prevent damage from really sticking, which is important against Sabine in particular because her ability adds some reach. So Benthic 2 Tubes hits the base for 2, buffs the Spec Force Soldier's next attack, but the Spec Force Soldier isn't going to get that attack because Yoda swings in and defeats him, also healing the base for 2. That's a situation where Leia's ability is a lot more useful than Sabine's. So with Leia, the Benthic 2 Tubes can attack and then have the unit that it buffed immediately attack if that unit is a rebel by using Leia's leader ability, which ends up getting a large amount of value. By preventing the opponent from countering that Benthic 2 Tubes ability. Restored Arc swinging on in after my opponent uses Sabine's ability and continuing to get a lot of value from that Restored Arc. And I still have a lot of resources with the board already favoring me. My opponent brings in a Fighters for Freedom. We're going to go ahead and have Luke defeat the Fighters for Freedom. This time I believe I do remember to use my Jedi lightsaber here. So on attack, giving the defender -2/-2. I'm going to go ahead and defeat the Fighters for Freedom, taking only 1 damage in return. And I can shield Yoda here with the on attack ability. Technically, you do that before you attack, but I think people are normally not strict with that timing. But on attack abilities do resolve before you attack, which is different from when this unit completes on attack abilities, which resolve after you've completed the attack, so you have to have lived through your attack in order for those abilities to have a result. So now we're going to spend 4 resources here, bring out Kanan Jarrus, and we're going to go ahead and, with the takedown already in hand as well, we're going to go ahead and use the open fire, clear out Benthic 2 Tubes, and now this game is looking very stabilized. I have 4 units, one of them is a buff to Luke, um, and the other 3 all have healing. My opponent doesn't have a board. I have more resources. I have equal cards in hand. It's really a very favorable scenario. The only real metric on which I'm losing is base HP, where I have 10 remaining and my opponent has 16, thanks to being on a 30 HP base. But it's really not necessarily a big deal. I have 15 damage on board, which is close to lethal, though not quite there. If my opponent uses Sabine's ability this turn, which is now maybe the only way that my opponent is going to reliably do damage to me at this point, that is going to, I believe, bring things into the lethal range. Okay, so now we see a card resource there. Um, I think Yakos was considering whether or not to do that for some time, but did end up going for the resource, and we're going to see what happens here. 4 resources for an aggression, so this is going to be used to defeat up to 2 upgrades. And I believe the second choice, so you get to choose 2. It's draw a card defeat up to two upgrades, deal 4 damage to a unit, or ready a unit with 3 or less power. Maybe it's 4 or less power. So what my opponent's going to do there is defeat the lightsaber and the shield on Yoda and deal 4 damage to Luke, getting Luke off the board. Pretty efficient card there. Um, Dealing with the buffed Luke, and it is going to mean my opponent is no longer in the lethal range this turn. But the problem is I'm going to, that resolved one of the 4 units that I had on the board, and while it did kill the strongest one, my remaining units are still able to put pressure on my opponent's base while also healing me and getting me further out of range of a potential aggro surprise. So this game is honestly looking pretty over, but we'll see what happens here. Sabine's ability used, one to each base. I'm going to go ahead and hit the base here with Kanan. That's going to deal 4 damage. And we're going to mill the top card. And I believe once again we see, yeah, single aspect card, a keep fighting. So that's going to be a single point of healing for my own base. My opponent spends 2 resources on Sabine Explosives Artist. I'm going to go ahead and hit for 2 more damage on the base, healing my base for 1, and then we're going to use Jedi Luke here to defeat Sabine and develop another really powerful and restoring unit. So now this game is looking incredibly over. I have 4 units that are very strong, and I'm now ahead on base HP substantially, ahead on cards in hand, ahead on resources, and I have control of the board. So game one looking pretty good for my red Luke here against Sabine. The final life total or the final base HP actually probably isn't representative of how close the game actually was because my opponent got closer than this and I healed a long way out of it. So, normally I think if you were winning with only 12 damage on your base against an aggro deck, that would mean that something had gone really wrong for the opponent, or had perhaps gone really wrong for the opponent. But the fact that I was able to heal so much with all those restore units made things a little different. So now we're going to do some sideboarding. So given that my opponent has this very powerful anti-attachment tech, and might be running even more of it if they sideboard in disabling Fang Fighter. I'm thinking about what I want to do, and I think what I'm going to do is cut my Jedi lightsabers here. So looking at my sideboard, I could bring in Fang Fighters of my own, but it doesn't really look like there's upgrades to remove, so that's not very important. Vanquish is a card for a different sort of scenario. We are going to bring in 2 copies of the Redemption Medical Frigate, though. That is a large unit that has a powerful stabilizing effect. When used, it can be used to heal a large amount of damage on play. And then we're going to put a Carabast in as well. That's going to be just another cheap removal card, and we're going to cut the Jedi lightsabers. We're going to leave Luke's lightsaber in, which is a little less vulnerable to upgrade removal, but is not necessarily going to be a super valuable card in this matchup. Honestly, I would like to be sideboarding Luke's lightsaber out in favor of cards like I'd like to be sideboarding Luke's lightsaber out in favor of cards like Make an Opening, but do not have Make an Opening currently in the main deck or sideboard. I actually think, given given the current situation, I think Make an Opening should probably actually be a main board card. But I did not include it in this composition. So, lesson learned for future Luke decks, I think. Okay, let's see what we're doing here. So it looks like it's going to be an A-wing start. My opponent is going first, which would normally make an A-wing start very risky because A-wings counter each other. The advantage to an A-wing start for me in this scenario, though, is that I have Tarkin Town. So if my opponent plays an A-wing, I play an A-wing, my opponent attacks and kills my A-wing, I can use Tarkin Town to clear their A-wing, which is a good position to be in. But my opponent actually plays to the ground arena instead with Sabine Wren Explosives Artist. I'm going to go ahead and play my A-Wing, and then I have some follow-ups that should provide some good restore with Yoda and Kanan waiting in the wings. Sabine's ability used for 1 damage to each base. One note is that in this matchup, I actually prefer Restored Arc to the A-Wing. And the reason for that is that the Restored Arc's restore is more valuable than the A-Wing's extra damage. So we have a Force Throw and a Wing Leader. So one thing that I could do is go for a Wing Leader, buff the A-Wing, very aggressive play. But I think trying to race this is going to be futile because my opponent has a 30 HP base, has a 30 HP base, a much more aggressive leader, and in general, I just don't think that's going to go very well. I need to be the control. I need to be the control in this matchup, not the beatdown. I actually end up resourcing the wing leader because I think it's highly vulnerable to my opponent's aggression card. Yeah, it's not like bad enough that I'm cutting it, but it's not as good as it is in some matchups. So we end up playing out Yoda instead. Yoda did well for me last game with the restore. If my opponent opts to deal with Yoda with attacks, as we saw in the last game, it's still damage that's not going to go to my base. If my opponent doesn't deal with Yoda, I'll have a lot of restore. And if Yoda is removed, I do get to draw a card to replace him. So hopefully Yoda is going to be a bit of an obstacle for my opponent there. Yoda also enables Force Throw, which is a relevant card. Sabine swings in for 3 damage. There's actually an argument for passing here to try to shoot down any spaceship that shows up. But under the circumstances, I'm actually just going to swing and try to retain initiative. So A-Wing swings into the base for 3. And my opponent is going to spend, I believe it's 3 resources here for a Fighters for Freedom. 3 cost, 3/4 with Saboteur, and when you play another aggression card, you may deal 1 damage to your opponent's base. Or maybe it's to A base. I don't know if you can damage yourself with it. Currently, you don't want to damage yourself, but there could be some crazy situation in the future. Okay, so drawing up here, we see a copy of Red 3, and we see a Spec Force Soldier. Not a very strong card in this matchup. The Spec Force Soldier, not a very strong card here. I do have the initiative, but unfortunately, I don't have a buff that would allow Yoda to take out one of these units. I could force throw my opponent here, but another option would be to wait and try to remove my opponent's Sabine with the takedown that I have in hand. So what I'm going to do here, though, is I actually I swing Yoda into the Fighters for Freedom, taking 3 damage but dealing 2 damage. This puts my opponent in a spot where if we don't see an attack from the Fighters for Freedom, I can just clear it with the Tarkin Town that I have in hand. I could also potentially force throw my opponent, and if they discard a card that costs 2 or more, that would set up a defeat for the Fighters for Freedom as well. The force throw on the opponent is a little risky because we do have Metal Ceremony in this build. So that's going to be 3 damage to my base with an attack from the Fighters, and we're going to see how things continue. I'm going to go ahead and use Tarkin Town to clear the Fighters for Freedom because, first off, this stalls, which is somewhat useful to me at this time. But the second thing is that using Tarkin Town here means that if my opponent plays more red cards this turn, I won't be taking the bonus damage that I would otherwise take from Fighters for Freedom. Base takes 3 from Sabine. I'm going to go ahead and swing in for 3 damage of my own with the Alliance X-Wing. Or not the Alliance X-Wing, the Green Squadron A-Wing. I don't think I'm playing Alliance X-Wing in this build. 1 to each base. So here I have to make a choice. So one thing that I could do is I could Immediately play Kanan or immediately play red 3 and shield red 3. Another thing that I could do is wait for Sabine and then play takedown. If I pass here, my opponent sort of knows that I'm waiting. I could also do force throw plus red 3, but the force throw is probably not going to get a ton of value here, given that my opponent has a cheap deck and will probably be able to discard something that costs less than 3 and not lose his Sabine Explosives Artist. Um, keep fighting here to ready up Sabine. I'm going to go ahead and force throw. I actually force throw the Kanan to kill that Sabine. Um, and so that prevents me from taking 3 more damage there. I don't actually know if that was correct. I think playing the Kanan might have been better at this point to just give me a like on-field unit that can cause some problems for my opponent. But I decided to take kind of the guaranteed option there. My opponent deploys a Spec Force soldier. I'm going to go ahead and deploy, or I'm going to go ahead and, I keep saying deploy, I'm going to go ahead and play red 3. So that does develop my board further. And the advantage of the force throw kill is that it's very cheap and efficient in terms of resources, and cards aren't necessarily the bottleneck. My opponent plays Benthic 2 tubes. I have red 3 and the A-Wing and Yoda. My opponent here, I think, is likely going to kill Yoda with Sabine. I was sort of hoping that he would just go to base, but killing Yoda here makes more sense because you still get to use your on-attack ability to deal 1 damage to the base. So you lose 2 damage to base, but in return, Yoda doesn't heal 2 at the start of the next turn and doesn't kill 2 tubes. So that ends up being a pretty favorable exchange for my opponent. Yeah, it's an interesting question whether it was correct to do that forced throw. It felt good in the moment, but the I draw a card with Yoda and draw another red 3. The forced throw felt good in the moment, but I wonder if it would have been better to actually play out Kanan there instead and just accept the 3 damage from Sabine Explosives Artist and then try and get some big value because I'm not going to be able to get Luke for another turn. So and then this turn is going to be awkward. So we'll have to see what happens here. I do have a strong presence in space, but I'm not going to win a race between space and ground. I think it would be better to be playing things that are more relevant in my opponent's arena. So I think in retrospect, I probably rather would have played Kanan rather than throwing Kanan to defeat that Sabine. I felt like it was good there as a counter to my opponent's keep fighting, but in retrospect, I think I'd rather have more of the ground presence, even if it meant my opponent having 1 more unit and me having 3 damage on the base. Um, but we'll see how it goes. I think the potential value of getting to defeat that unit and play a unit of my own that turn seemed high to me, but I think it would have been better if the unit were like a Yoda instead of the a Yoda, for instance, instead of that red 3, because red 3 is like it is a like it's a solid unit, but it's in the wrong arena here. So my opponent swings in with 2 tubes for 4 damage thanks to a precision fire and buffs the next attack for the Spec Force soldier, I believe. This is a situation where I have a good response, which is that I can play a removal card from hand and kill the Spec Force soldier. That's exactly what I do. So Spec Force soldier off the board, and the 2 stats there from 2 tubes are wasted. I then also have the ability to attack with red 3 and do some more damage to my opponent's base. But I want to emphasize, though, my opponent is on a 30 HP base, so even though the damage totals are looking close here, my opponent is actually more ahead than it looks like because 25 is the win condition for him and 30 is the win condition for me in terms of damage to the enemy base. Benthic 2 tubes here. 1 cost 2/2 on attack. Another friendly aggression unit gains raid 2 for the phase. It gets +2 power while attacking. Very useful ability. Good stat line. We'll see how it goes here. Yakos actually plays aggression here, opting to deal 4 damage to pick off my red 3 and then to ready Benthic 2 tubes. And this is a really good play because readying Benthic 2 tubes means that he can not only attack again with 2 tubes, but attacking with 2 tubes will buff Sabine and give her +2 for the next attack. So now Sabine can swing in here and inflict 5. And so now I'm really in trouble. I have some healing options available, which are nice to see, but seems like they're arriving a bit late. I'm going to go ahead and just take down Sabine at the start so that she can't defeat my base. The problem here, though, is that 2 tubes can hit my base for 2, and that leaves me at 1 HP, and Sabine will be able to kill me at the start of the next turn. So this turn, I'm going to be like fairly stabilized, but it doesn't really matter because, here we are. Um, 2 tubes swings in for 2. At this point, it's basically over unless my opponent botches it. I'm going to go ahead and bring in Luke. My opponent plays, I think it's a Spec Force soldier here. Yeah, it's a Spec Force soldier here. I am going to go ahead and force throw my opponent, forcing them to discard their remaining card and allowing me to deal damage with it. And that's going to be a Sabine Ran Explosives Artist. We're going to use that to defeat 2 tubes of the Spec Force Soldier, and Luke can defeat the other one while also shielding my A-Wing. And this all sounds really good, except that I'm on 1 HP. So my opponent takes the initiative, and I just concede here, even though I have wiped the board and taken control. The fact that I'm at 1 HP means that Sabine can just use her ability to win 1 damage to each base. So in that game, we ended up stabilizing towards the end, but it was just a bit too late. And I do wonder whether deploying that cannon to allow him to heal more and taking the 3 damage from Sabine would have been better. I honestly don't know. It's hard to say. I could have potentially used the force throw on a future turn, but at the same time, who's to say what would have happened? Um, Ultimately, my opponent sort of surprised me with the keep fighting on 2 tubes, which was a lot of value there because it represented not just a 2 HP swing, but actually a 4 HP swing, where 2 tubes hit my base for 2 and then buffed Sabine's attack for 2 as well. On to round 3, and I do get to go first this time. I'm going to lead off with Sabine Explosives Artist. So I have the ability to play to either ground or space. There's actually an argument here that I should pass and see what my opponent does, but Sabine Explosives Artist I think is a good choice here. I can follow up with the Wing Leader to buff her, and that will put me in a relatively good spot. Because with a Wing Leader buffing Sabine Explosives Artist, I will then be in a position to defeat Leader Sabine as soon as she deploys, since a buffed Sabine Explosives Artist can deal 5 damage to an opponent's unit. Additionally, the Wing Leader will itself be in a position to trade with my opponent's A-Wing, which doesn't sound like it would be the case because the A-Wing defeats the Wing Leader while remaining alive, but I can use Tarkentown to kind of seal the deal there. So what we're going to do here is go ahead and we're going to go ahead and bring in the Wing Leader here, buffing Sabine. So now I have a powerhouse unit in the ground arena, and I have a space unit that won't be able to deal with my opponent's A-Wing this turn, but in conjunction with potential buffs like a Fleet Lieutenant, or with Tarkentown, can take out the A-Wing in the next turn. My opponent spends 3 resources here on red 3. putting another unit in space. I'm going to go ahead and swing in for 5 damage to my opponent's base with Sabine. Solid hit there. My opponent, of course, can swing back for 4 damage to my base with this A-Wing. And I'm going to go ahead and take the initiative. I see a copy of the Forces with me, as well as a Fleet Lieutenant, both of which allow that wing leader to trade up for one of my opponent's units. So the Forces with me, I don't have a Force unit on the board, but just playing it for its current effect would allow me to get 2 experience tokens on the wing leader and then swing. And the 2 experience giving it +2/+2 will mean that it will actually survive an attack from either of those opposing ships, which will then put the wing leader still alive and in a position to clear the remaining ship on the next turn if my opponent doesn't otherwise remove it. So I'm actually thinking this is a very solid situation for me to be in. I can play the Forces with me, take out a ship, and then have Sabine in position to kill my opponent's Sabine, which sounds great. So we're going to go ahead and use the Forces with me. Wing leader gets +2/+2, and I have the wing leader take out my opponent's I'm going to have the wing leader here take out my opponent's red 3 with the attack from the Forces with me. So now still alive on 1 HP thanks to the experience and poised to potentially trade with that A-Wing in the next turn. And I have Sabine in play in the ground arena, so this is looking very solid. The other main option there would have been to use the Fleet Lieutenant instead to just go and trade. That develops another unit on the ground arena. But I like this. And I can potentially use Luke's ability to shield the Fleet Lieutenant as well. But I like this version of the play better because it leaves me with a unit in space that is going to be able to potentially shoot down my opponent's other ship in a future turn, and then just get more of my opponent's units off the board. At this point, though, my opponent hits me with a really strong play, and one that I had not necessarily anticipated. I wasn't thinking about this, but aggression here is a giant reversal because what my opponent is going to do here is defeat up to 2 upgrades. So it's going to defeat 1 experience on the wing leader, that defeats it, and then it defeats 1 experience on Sabine, and then does 4 damage to Sabine. So it gets a 2-for-1 here, and actually really it's a huge blowout swing because now I've lost my wing leader and I've lost my answer to Sabine. So now instead of being in a position where I was poised to take over the board, my opponent has an unanswered unit on the ground and in space because Sabine gets to deploy this turn. So this was super negative for me. Um, in retrospect, if I had thought about it, I could have avoided that blowout by having my wing leader take out the A-wing instead of taking out red 3. If I had taken out the A-wing, I would have been alive with 2 HP remaining, which would have meant that my opponent would have had to choose one of the 2 units to kill and couldn't have gotten the 2-for-1. But as it stands, the blowout play from aggression there has really reversed the positions in this game, and I went from feeling like I had a strong advantage to feeling like I am really in trouble and trying to stabilize here. It's the difference between, oh, this A-wing is going to hit me, but my opponent's Sabine is going to die if she deploys into my Sabine, and I'm in a position to take control. Versus, oh man, I have no board. My opponent has stuff in both arenas. This is super bad. We're going to try and counter with, we can play out Yoda here. So he has that healing for some potential stabilization. He's also enables the force throw that I have in hand, and I can use Luke's ability to shield. My opponent swings in for 3 with Sabine. In this situation, I'm actually going to force throw. I really, so I've taken too much damage at this point, relative to where I want to be. At only 8 HP left, I feel like I can't afford to let that A-wing swing here. And my opponent has a low cost curve, so there's a very high chance that a force throw on my opponent would not actually allow me to defeat that A-wing. especially because it has a buff from the medal ceremony. So while I could do a small amount of damage and then remove it with Tarkentown, I think that I can't afford to wait that long. So I actually force throw this Redemption Medical Frigate to kill the A-Wing in one shot. And this does leave the board clear, and perhaps I'll be able to, play some other stuff and use Yoda's healing and so on to come back. My opponent plays another A-Wing, which I don't love. I'm going to go ahead and I think I used Luke's ability here to shield Yoda. It might have been better to take initiative here. There's at least an argument to just take initiative in this situation, but I think there's a good chance that my opponent will have at least one more card to play given the number of cards in hand. And the cheap cost curve. And indeed, we see a keep fighting, which I really do not want to see, and that allows Sabine to attack for another 4 damage thanks to the buff from Metal Ceremony, and now we are 1 Sabine attack away from death. And this one is basically over, unfortunately. My opponent also plays a Spec Force Soldier here. Um, and we have no answers, so that's the game. So I forget exactly what I do here, but I've basically already lost. I think the correct play here is probably, yeah, I mean, there's just nothing. So Yoda can attack and kill the Spec Force Soldier. I end up deploying Luke here, which is wrong because Sabine can just attack and defeat the base, and indeed does. But I think nothing saves me. So if I do Yoda attack into the Spec Force Soldier, it heals for 2, but my opponent can just swing with the remaining 2 units for a total of 7 damage and close things out before Luke can take out Sabine. And yeah, so this was an interesting game because I felt like I was very strongly ahead early on, but I ended up accidentally, playing into that aggression, which I hadn't expected, and my opponent scoring that devastating 2-for-1 that really turned the game on its head and put him firmly into the driver's seat, and I was unable to stabilize after that. If I had killed the A-Wing instead of Red 3, and my opponent had to choose which of the units to kill and which would remain alive, would that have been enough to swing the game? I'm not sure. It's very possible my opponent could have won things anyway. But getting 2-for-1 at that time and losing 2 buffed units was huge and really turned things around. So that's going to be it for this match. And Yakos gets the win, 2-1 or 1-2 for me, 2-1 for Yakos, and goes on to continue to the quarterfinals. I was honestly pretty fine with being knocked out because it actually meant that I got to go ahead and do some casting and commentary on some of the other games. So I'm going to be kind of doing a little bit of editing to get those into a nice YouTube friendly format, with some of the dead time between games and so on removed. And those should be going up on the channel tomorrow, I believe. So stay tuned for some more coverage of this tournament. My own run in it was unfortunately brief, but that's what happens sometimes. Ultimately, Yakos played it well and had some nice tricks with the keep fighting and some of the other stuff that Red Sabine could pull off here that put him in a good position to get the win. So congratulations to Yakos for beating me here, and we will see how things went in the rest of the tournament in the upcoming video uploads. So I will catch you guys later. Thanks for watching, guys.